Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology, where we try to unravel the true histories of the bizarre mysteries of life. So, normally I start my tales at the beginning, but this time I'm going to kind of bounce around the timeline a little bit. But trust me, it'll all make sense in the long run, particularly thanks to the power of editing. So, we're going to actually start our story on the 28th of August, 1905. And this takes place in the little, town or municipality or whatever of Comminges, Switzerland. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm not really familiar with Swiss geography, but if I recall, I think it's in southwest Switzerland, near the French border. So on this day in 1905, Jean, I don't know, French is weird, Lanfray, was having lunch with his father, and for some reason, whatever reason, I don't know, probably because they were stupid, they decided to go binge drinking. So Lanfray consumes a single sandwich, followed by, and this is actually documented, 7 glasses of wine, 6 glasses of cognac, 1 coffee laced with brandy, 2 creme de menthe, and 2 glasses of absinthe after eating this single sandwich. He then returns home drunk with his father and has another coffee with brandy. And it's at this time when his pregnant wife comes out, and you can probably guess that she's furious. He, at some point in this drunken stupor, decides that he's gonna just get into an argument with his wife, and at some point during the argument, he demands that she shine his shoes, to which she responds, "No, I'm not going to shine your shoes." So after she refused this weird order from this crazed drunk man, he just coldly grabs this Vertelli rifle, which was a common rifle found in most homes in Switzerland at the time, and he just calmly and coldly just shoots her in the head, execution style. And at this point, his father, who's also there, just flees the scene. He runs to go get the police. Upon hearing this commotion, Lanfray's 4-year-old daughter runs into the room, and he shoots her right there as she's coming into the room. He then goes through the house and he finds his 2-year-old daughter Blanche, and he executes her as well. After this, I guess he starts to come to his senses a little bit about what he did, and he decides that he's gonna off himself. However, this just being kind of a bulky Swiss rifle, it was kind of based on the 1866 Winchester. He kind of fucks up the angle, and he just ends up shooting himself through the jaw. He then proceeds to pick up Blanche's body, and he carries her out to the garden where he collapses. He was found in that garden merely minutes later after his father had contacted the police, and he ends up in the hospital being put on trial for murder. So he languishes in jail, and then on 23 February 1906, his trial takes place, and his attorneys use kind of an odd defense. They assert that despite all the alcohol he had consumed that day, it was the 2 ounces of absinthe which was solely responsible for his madness and caused him to commit this horrific act. This not only was backed up by his lawyers, but it was backed up by a witness, a leading Swiss psychologist named Dr. Albert Mayheim, who argued that this was a classic case of absinthe madness. Now, the prosecutor, Alfred Oberst, argued that the 2 ounces of absinthe that he ingested were minor in relation to the large amount of alcohol he had consumed, and they can't simply blame this all on absinthe madness. So that very same day the trial ended, he was found guilty on all 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, he had killed himself by hanging himself in his prison cell only a few days later. And this was kind of the final straw, the spark that led to the outlawing and prohibition of absinthe throughout Europe and the Western world. After this trial, the growing temperance movement kind of got a hold of it. They exacerbated it in the media. They created this moral panic and got the infamous drink outlawed. And Lanfray, his tale goes on to be exaggerated. It said that in this absinthe madness, he had actually axe murdered his entire family, and that this low-brow drink of bohemian culture and artists and communists and the underclass basically all the dregs of society, was eroding Western culture. And this ban eventually throws absinthe into a category of myth and legend in and of itself. And that's really the crux of the story we are diving into today. The story of absinthe, the story of the Green Fairy, that mythical, highly alcoholic alcoholic drink which was said to give you hallucinations, send you into madness. The drink of the artist and the bohemians and the goths and the dark and the macabre. The infamous ceremonies around its consumption, its mythical origins, and what it's become today. Because it really did become a mythical drink, especially when, like, I was in high school, the late 90s, early 2000s. Absinthe was almost mythical. It was thought to be like, for lack of a better example, LSD in a drink. I mean, any teen who was into the kind of that goth culture of the 80s, 90s knows what I'm talking about. It was depicted in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it was also depicted in that crazy movie From Hell. It was also depicted in Nine Inch Nails' music video, The Perfect Drug. It was this mythical, awesome drink, and it was something you heard of in, like, urban legend. Some kid would come up to you, usually one of the, like, industrial or goth kids, which there were a few in my rural redneck high school. I was kind of one of them. Even though I mostly associated with that kind of punk rock skateboarder scene, I did really love the goth scene, and I was heavily involved. But, you know, every high school back then had that, like, one goth kid or that one industrial kid that was like, dude, man, yeah, I was at Burning Man, and I tried absinthe, and it was like a trip, you know? I saw the Green Fairy, man, and she, like, told me things, man, about the universe and stuff. But now we're getting really ahead of ourselves, so let's stop. Let's ask ourselves, what is absinthe? Where did it come from? Why was it banned? And how did it achieve this mythical status? And now we're going to start at the beginning. So simply put, what the hell is absinthe? Where did it come from? So simply put, absinthe is a spirit. Now, a lot of people will claim it's a liqueur, but it's not. Liqueurs are usually bottled with sugars and sweeteners and usually have a lower alcohol content. Absinthe doesn't follow that rule. While it does have things like anise and fennel and wormwood and other medicinal herbs, it's actually a very bitter drink. They don't add sugars or sweeteners in the bottling process, and it's usually somewhere between 45 to 75 alcohol by volume, or in the United States, that's 90 to 148 proof. It's also traditionally known to have a distinct green flavor. However, most absinthes produced today are actually clear. And anytime you see it depicted in film with that deep green coloration, that's usually food coloring or some added effect. Now, they also do have a type of absinthe called a red absinthe. I think it's from somewhere here in the United States on the East Coast. It might be from New York or maybe Maine. I don't really remember off the top of my head. And to be honest, while it's called a red absinthe, it's really not red to the eye. It kind of almost has like an orange look or almost like a urine look to it, but I digress. So put simply, it is a spirit derived from several plants, including the flowers and leaves of the grand wormwood and anise and fennel. It's about 45 to 74% alcohol by volume, and it has this super bitter, almost black licorice taste to it. 9 times out of 10, you have to dilute it by using water, or you run it over ice, or you use a sugar cube, because in its pure bottled form, it's freaking almost undrinkable. So that's basically what it is. Now, where did it come from? So this whole thing starts in the late 18th century in the canton of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. And it was this French doctor by the name of Pierre Ordinaire who actually kind of invented it or distilled it for the first time. And he wasn't actually looking to create a new alcoholic beverage. He was actually looking to create a patent medicine. And it's actually the Latinized word of one of the ingredients that gives us the name of the drink, absinthe. It comes from Artemisia absinthium, or however it's said. I don't speak Latin. But it's basically the wormwood plant, and the wormwood plant really gives absinthe this mythical origin. Everybody says that it's the wormwood that makes it hallucinogenic and gives it its color and leads to the absinthe madness. Well, that's all myth. Now, wormwood does give absinthe its bitter taste, and it does influence the color a little bit. But wormwood historically has been used as a medicine since at least the 900s AD, probably even further back than that. And it makes sense at the end of the 18th century, if you're making a patent medicine, you're going to use a well-known plant that has a bunch of properties that can be seen as beneficial. For example, this plant is known to have antifungal, neuroprotective, insecticidal, antimicrobial, antimalarial, and antidepressant properties. And it was in common use all over Europe. People would use it to brew beer when there was an absence of hops. They'd use it as a bittering agent. People would use it as kind of an essential oil. It would ward off ticks and fleas, which carry disease. So naturally, if you're creating some kind of patent medicine, you're going to want to put something like that in your patent medicine. It's just a good idea. However, what really launches wormwood into the myth of all this is this compound known as thujon. Now, thujon is basically a toxic compound that can cause seizures in high doses. Wormwood itself contains very minuscule trace amounts of this compound, and even in the distillation of absinthe, it's said that you can find minuscule trace amounts of it, especially in the old days. But it's kind of like that myth of cocaine and Coca-Cola. While it's true that Coca-Cola in the early days did contain trace amounts of cocaine, the myth of that kind of blows up in the media, and then it makes everybody think that you can get high off cocaine if you drink Coca-Cola. But at the end of the day, these are trace amounts. They're minuscule. They almost have no effect on anything at all, just like the case of thujon in absinthe. And if you want to hear more about the cocaine and Coca-Cola myth, I actually did a deep dive into that in my season 3 episode about food myths, so go check that episode out. It's a very popular one. So coming back off of that tangent, we're back in Switzerland with Dr. whatever French guy, I don't remember his name. But this new drink that he creates is an instant success. He's selling it across, pharmacies or shops or whatever, all across France and Switzerland, and, it makes it all over Europe. And it even makes it to the Americas. It's said that even Edgar Allan Poe, the father of modern Gothic horror, had drank it. Now, that's probably just a myth. We do know Edgar Allan Poe was an alcoholic. I don't recall any stories of him drinking absinthe, but maybe I'll deep dive into that when I do a deep dive into his life story in a later episode. But it takes off in popularity, and it becomes the drink of artists and writers and struggling bohemians and, prostitutes and painters, which I guess is just redundant with artists. But at the end of the day, I guess what I'm getting around is it becomes the working class drink, the poor man's drink. Kind of like how vodka is kind of the working man's drink in Russia today. It's cheap to manufacture, it's widely available, it becomes a drink of the working class, it gets associated with the culture. And this is really what's happening in France amongst the working class and the artists. However, there starts to become a little problem in France. The social conservatives, the upper classes, that hot bourgeoisie, they see it being associated with this working class bohemian culture, and they don't like it. They see it as moral degradation. It's an attack on the social structure of France, this highly alcoholic, low-class common drink. But by the 1840s, its popularity was steadily growing. It really took off in popularity when it was given to French soldiers as an anti-malarial kind of treatment or medicine, which makes sense. It does have anti-malarial properties. It's found in wormwood. And these French troops, they develop a taste for it, so when they're home in Paris or whatever, they want that drink. So it becomes really popular in bars and bistros and cafes and cabarets. And by the 1860s, it was so popular in these establishments that the hours between 5 and 6 p.m. became known as l'heure verte, or l'heure verte, or however French is, I don't remember. Also known as the green hour, which I guess is a precursor to happy hours today. And by the time of the 1880s, thanks to improvements in mass production, it caused a steep price drop in the drink, and it started being exported pretty much all over the world. It got to the point where they were consuming 36 million liters per year of the stuff, and a lot of people started calling it France's national drink. So over the course of the 19th century, it had become immensely popular, and rightfully so. Any drink of the working class becomes immensely popular. Look at Coca-Cola, look at Budweiser, or Bud Light now, I guess. However, this creates a problem for France, because France isn't known for absinthe today. We all know that historically, all the way back to the Roman times, France has always been known for one thing: wine. France has always been the world leader in wine production. The national drink of France is wine. But something happens in the 19th century where absinthe nearly overtakes it, and this leads to this smear campaign against the drink, which led to all the urban myths which surround it today. But for this next segment, we have to actually look at what was going on in the French wine industry in the 19th century. And to be honest, I don't know why this subject isn't brought up more often when discussing the story of absinthe. This story isn't even brought up on the Wikipedia page about absinthe. It is a critical part of the story when discussing the history of this drink, and it's the story of the Great French Wine Blight. So for this, we have to skip back on the timeline a little bit, back to the 1850s. So the Great French Wine Blight was a severe blight in the mid-19th century that destroyed almost all of France's vineyards. It laid complete waste to their wine industry. And this blight was actually one of the many things that was a result of worldwide trading. So in the late 1850s, an aphid, which is basically a small sap-sucking insect, from North America hitches a ride over to France. Once it gets to France, and I guess it reproduces or whatever, these French vines have no immunity to this new introduced aphid. And think of it in the same way as a plague or a virus spreads around the world thanks to trade. It's kind of the same thing, it's just affecting the plant world. And it didn't just happen in France. This aphid kind of spread across Europe at a rapid pace and devastated other vineyards in other countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal. But France was hit the hardest. So the first signs of this blight really show up in a village around 1863, at least that's the first documented sign. And the description of the disease at that time is, quote, "It reminded them distressingly of consumption. These aphids were killing these vines and killing them quickly and then moving on to the next ones." And long story short, this blight would last from the 1850s to the mid-1870s. It literally wipes out 40% of the French wine industry. Vineyards that had operated for hundreds of years had to shut down. Wages at these vineyards that stayed afloat were cut in half. And it was said that at this time, the damage to the French economy was roughly 10 billion francs. Now, eventually they do come up with a solution, realizing that this aphid came from North America. These growers in these vineyards, they decided that they were going to get their hands on American rootstocks, which are naturally resistant to these aphids. And they had to graft their vines onto this American rootstock and hope for the best. Now, this did cause a lot of confrontation and a split in the wine industry. There were the Americanists who were bringing in these American rootstocks, and then there were the chemists who thought that they could defeat the aphid through chemicals and they didn't have to sully their perfect French vines with these disgusting American rootstocks. However, this does save the French wine industry. But at the very time, while they're dealing with this great French wine blight, prices of wine are skyrocketing. And this is kind of going on all over Europe because remember, the French weren't the only ones affected by this blight. The Germans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Italians, which are really known for their wine, they were all dealing with this blight as well, and less production means higher prices. So essentially, your working class, your bohemians, your artists, your soldiers, they're not drinking a lot of wine during this time. They're going to move towards more affordable working class drinks. And what was that affordable working class drink that was gaining in popularity during this time? Absinthe. And this becomes an existential threat to the whole wine industry because while they're dealing with this blight, they have this popular alcoholic drink that they are now competing with. And this drink becomes so popular, it's exported all over the world. It actually develops a big cult following in New Orleans. New Orleans was credited as the birthplace of the Sazerac, which is an absinthe-based cocktail. And the old Absinthe house down on Bourbon Street, they actually began selling absinthe in the first half of the 19th century. In 1874, it's literally renamed the Absinthe Room, and it was said to be a place where you could get absinthe in the Parisian style. And this bar was frequented by Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, FDR, Aleister Crowley, and Frank Sinatra. But it's at this time when absinthe has reached this peak in popularity that the wine industry is freaking out. The key players in the wine industry are thinking they're going to lose everything. What are they going to do if wine is no longer the national drink of France? So they decide they have to demonize this drink. They have to launch a smear campaign against it. If they can turn the public opinion away from absinthe and turn it back to wine, that noble, illustrious drink of French society, this crisis can be somewhat diverted. And that's precisely what they do. The wine industry, the key players in the wine industry, they start hobnobbing with the temperance movement and various politicians and a lot of social elites in and around Paris. And they essentially just start a misinformation campaign. They start demonizing the drink. They say that it leads to upswings in crime and violent behavior. It can lead to madness and murder and a complete breakdown in French society. And one criticizer of absinthe, who was probably on the wine industry's payroll, claimed the following, and this is a direct quote that I found on Wikipedia actually. "Absinthe makes you crazy and criminal, provokes epilepsy and tuberculosis, and has killed thousands of French people. It makes a ferocious beast of a man, a martyr of women, and a degenerate of the infant. It disorganizes and ruins the family and menaces the future of the country." It kind of sounds like something Nixon would have said about hippies, but I digress. But the word was getting out there. These social elites, these politicians, these movers and shakers of Parisian society were starting to gain a negative view of absinthe. They were starting to look down on it. And this negative view of absinthe shows up as early as 1859 in the art world. And after 60 plus episodes, I finally get to talk about a little bit of art history, which I am ecstatic about. And in this part, I'm actually going to talk about an early painting by Edward Manet. And that's Manet, M-A-N-E-T, not to be confused with Monet. So in 1859, Manet creates what a lot of people consider to be his first major painting and first original artwork. It was called The Absinthe Drinker. And this painting kind of falls into that realism category of painting. It's thought that this painting was influenced by the works of Gustave Courbet, who was a realist painter in the 19th century, but I digress. It's also believed that this painting was inspired by a poem called Le Vin des Chiffonniers, or The Rag Picker's Wine. And this painting depicts a full-length portrait of an alcoholic chiffonnier, or rag picker, who used to frequent the area around the Louvre. Now, a rag picker is also known as a rag and bone man. He was a guy that would go from house to house and he would usually come around and he would ask the maid or the lady of the house or whatever if they had any old rags or scraps of paper or bones or broken glass or whatever he could get so he could resell it to merchants, because they would use this stuff in kind of a recycling method in order to create the products they were selling. And this was an actual job that people had that they went out every day and did. So back to the Absinthe Drinker, it's a portrait of this rag picker named Collard who kind of frequented that area around the Louvre. And the subject of the painting is standing, wearing a black top hat, and is wrapped in a brown cloak. And he's kind of standing in one of those traditional aristocratic poses that you see in old paintings. Now, on the ground at his feet is an empty discarded bottle, and sitting on the ledge to the right of him, that would be stage right, left side of the portrait to us looking at it, is a glass of absinthe. And we know that this is a glass of absinthe because it's in a distinctive absinthe glass, and it has that iconic green hue that we associate with that drink. Now, we're probably all wondering, why the hell am I discussing this painting? And it's because this painting becomes the first kind of subject in this smear campaign that goes on against absinthe. So it's said that towards the completion of the painting, Manet showed the work to his former master and asked for his opinion. And it's said that his former master critiqued it right then and there. He said, "An absinthe drinker and they paint abominations like that? My poor friend, you are the absinthe drinker. It is you who have lost your moral sense." So we can already see as early as 1859 there's already this demonization around this drink. It's seen as a root cause of moral degeneracy in French culture. So undeterred by his former master's criticism, he actually decides to submit it to the Paris Salon in 1859, and it is resoundingly rejected. And it's primarily believed to have been rejected due to this demonization of absinthe in French culture at the time. Now, while it was true that the painting did have a series of technical faults, for example, the legs kind of join the body awkwardly, there are visible brush strokes in places, and a few other things I won't really deep dive into, but it is largely believed that it was due to the nature of absinthe being present, which is why this painting was rejected at this salon. Even as it was still rising in popularity, it was being heavily demonized. However, while this is the first time we see absinthe showing up in a piece of art, it is far from the last. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, we see it showing up in art frequently. And the funny thing is, in all the art we see it depicted in, it's always in kind of a degenerate light. So for example, the French Impressionist artist Edgar Degas, in 1876, he paints L'Absinthe, or the absinthe drinker, or glass of absinthe. This painting depicts a woman and man sitting side by side drinking a glass of absinthe. They appear lethargic and lonely. The man wearing a hat looks to the right off the edge of the canvas, while the woman, who's dressed more formally, looks vacantly downward. A glass of absinthe clearly rests on the table in front of her. And once again, we know this is absinthe. It's in an absinthe glass, and it has that iconic green hue. Now, this work over the next 30 plus years was universally panned as being ugly and disgusting. People claim that it shows the moral degeneracy that was going on thanks to absinthe in these cafes and parlors and bars or whatever. The painting is said to have sparked controversy and outrage for years to come. And I think that's kind of easy to see why, because when you look at this painting, this woman, she does look forlorn and depressed. And when placed into the context of the demonization around absinthe at the time, it really does look like a critique on the absinthe culture, this degenerate bohemian underclass who are ruining French society because they are addicted to this green drink. And worst of all, that drink is not wine, so how dare they insult French culture? Now, other artists who are really into Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and Art Nouveau, they would depict absinthe in another light, a more glamorous light almost. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, he was known to be an absinthe drinker. It was even rumored that he had a hollow cane filled with absinthe so he can imbibe in it whenever he wanted to. And he was that impressionist artist who created these beautiful impressionistic scenes of the brothels and nightlife of Paris at the end of the 19th century, the Belle Époque. Also, Vincent van Gogh, or as the British say, Van Gogh, he was also known to drink large quantities of absinthe, and a lot of people think that's why he was insane. But in real life, Van Gogh was probably just suffering from severe mental illness, probably like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Picasso was also a well-known absinthe lover who depicted it in various media, in 2 paintings, I believe, and in a sculpture called the Absinthe Glass. So it's during this time in the late 19th century where it becomes associated with these artists and the Parisian nightlife and brothels, and its depiction in art didn't really help its reputation. It just kind of reinforced those negative stereotypes around it. And at the time, the wine industry, along with these prohibitionists, were funding these doctors who were doing these, quote, medical studies in order to prove definitively that absinthe was bad for you. It was hallucinogenic, it would lead to madness, it would lead to murder, it was highly addictive and responsible for the downfall of society, and if we don't stop it now, the whole world's gonna be overrun by brothels and degenerates and artists, and then they're all gonna go crazy and act axe murder each other. Takes us right up to that 1905 case where Jean Lafay murders his entire family, and it's blamed on absinthe. And after this notorious murder, that's when everything changes. That's when they start banning it throughout the 1910s. In 1908, Belgium and Brazil banned the sale and distribution of absinthe. In 1909, it was banned in the Netherlands. In 1910, it was banned in Switzerland. It was banned in the United States in 1912. And the place where it was most infamous, France, banned it in 1914. And the real final nail in the coffin that led to France finally banning it in 1914 was the onset of World War I. Now, at this time, France was recruiting soldiers for its army. It needed guys, they have to go fight the Germans. And France was having a very hard time finding men who were fit for service. And a large part of this was due to rampant alcoholism, and absinthe already having the stigma against it via this multi-year smear campaign is ultimately blamed for the degeneracy in men, which leads to these men being unfit for military service. So the government decides to ban it. And it's during these years in which it is banned where it really starts to take on that mythological status. Now, despite what a lot of people say, the drink wasn't banned worldwide. It was just banned in several countries. For example, it was still available in places like the Czech Republic. And actually, the ban in Switzerland just led to the production kind of being driven underground. Kind of like how Prohibition here in America actually created the largest black market of alcohol in history, which go to show that prohibitions do not work. The only thing a prohibition on anything does is just create a black market and then creates criminals out of everybody who indulges in that thing, be it alcohol, drugs, gambling, prostitution, whatever, insert prohibition here. So it's during these years when absinthe really goes underground, and over time it kind of falls out of popularity, but then there's a resurgence sometime around the 1990s. And this resurgence really takes advantage of the myths around absinthe, because around this time the myths were these same myths that I would hear when I was in like high school or whatever. Yeah, man, it's hallucinogenic, it'll make you trip balls, it's outlawed worldwide, and it leads to madness, and there's all this ceremony and pomp and circumstance around how you even present the drink, and you have to drink it in this specific way out of a specific glass and have a special fountain and only drink it over ice and all this other stuff. And it's through that myth where there's a revival in this idea of the Green Fairy. Now, the Green Fairy, how that's associated with absinthe, it's really part of an advertising campaign that was going on with absinthe during the Belle Epique. And to be honest, I actually used to have a bunch of copies of old advertisements, like posters and stuff for absinthe from that impressionist early Art Nouveau era, and prominently featured in those advertisements was this depiction of a green fairy. She was kind of the mascot for absinthe during the time. So back then, the late 1890s, early 1900s, the green fairy is really just associated with this ad campaign around absinthe. But it's in the 90s where we see a myth that the green fairy is something that you hallucinate after you indulge in absinthe. But there does come this revival, and it's mostly out of these countries that had never banned the drink and was still distilling the drink to this day. Like I said earlier, countries like the Czech Republic, Spain, Britain, Portugal, places where the drink was never popular, therefore it was never officially banned. However, in the 90s, there was also this resurgence of a group of people who was interested in things like cocktail science and recreating certain alcoholic beverages from history. And they would get a hold of these bottles of absinthe, and they realized that the quality that was being produced during this kind of lull in manufacturing, this lull in popularity, was very inferior. So they started to hunt down and attempt to recreate the original recipe from Pernod, the oldest distiller from France. And this rise in kind of the historical curiosity about the drink led to, in 2000, the first absinthe being distilled in France since 1914. That was called Lafite Absinthe, and now it's one of dozens of different absinthes that are produced in France commercially. Throughout the early 2000s, almost 100 years after it was banned, they started repealing the bans in all these countries that had initially banned it, and then there was a revival in the whole bartender kind of cocktail industry, and the whole thing just took off. And in December of 2007, the United States lifted its ban on it, and then after that, a lot of the myths surrounding it started to fade away as it became common in bars again. And a lot of that is due to the revival of the art of the cocktail over the last 10 years or so. And to be honest, the liquor industry is actually doing really well right now due to this resurgence. There are a lot of people out there who want to understand or rediscover the lost science and art of creating these perfect cocktails which are iconic in our history. One that I personally love is the resurgence in tiki culture, the art of creating or recreating those delicious tiki cocktails. And with those resurgences, absinthe follows, because there are several drinks and cocktails out there that use absinthe. As I mentioned earlier, the oldest cocktail to use absinthe was the Sazerac. Also off the top of my head, there's the Hemingway, the Green Swizzle, the Duchess, Death in the Afternoon, the Bohemian Mule, the Absinthe Mojito, the Absinthe Martini, and the most infamous cocktail of all when it comes to this drink, the Absinthe Frappe, which dates back to 1874, and was the way that most absinthe drinkers during the Belle Epoque were drinking their absinthe. Now, a lot of these cocktails, they're either absinthe-based cocktails or they're cocktails that have like a dash or two of absinthe in them. Because let's remember, absinthe is a very bitter tasting drink. It tastes like black licorice, I swear it does. And it's a taste that doesn't appeal to a lot of people, so like most spirits, you have to dilute them, and you dilute them by creating cocktails. However, there is another way to drink absinthe without adding a whole bunch of mixers and creating a cocktail, and it's simply this traditional way of doing it that has also got its own mystique around it. It's almost like a ceremony. So essentially, the best way to get this drink to be palatable is by doing a 5-to-1 ratio of water to absinthe. And a lot of time when you dilute it over a sugar cube, so it's going to add that sugar to the drink to kind of bring down that bitterness. And there are ways where you can buy like 2-part glasses and a very ornate absinthe spoon and this like fountain that drips the water down and dilutes it slowly, and then you get that like opaque look, and it's really expensive and stupid. And sometimes it can be very theatric and over the top. I mean, if you're in like a goth nightclub or something, you kind of want that theatric over the top experience. You're going to want the 2-part glass and the spoon, and you're going to want to watch them put the fountain on top and let it drip down, and it's very ornate and cool looking. But if you want to do that at home, there's actually a very cheap and easy way to do it. You don't have to go out and spend $200 on an ornate absinthe fountain. You can get this little drip device on Amazon for like $30. And an absinthe spoon for like, I don't know, $4, and then an absinthe glass for like, I don't know, another $4. And essentially all you do is you take your glass out, you pour in an ounce of absinthe, you put your little slotted spoon over the top of the glass with a sugar cube, and then you hook this little thing to it that creates this dripping method like a seesaw, so it'll drip water into the glass and drip water over the sugar cube. You put in your 5 ounces of water, then you sit there and let it drip while it dissolves this sugar cube. And then after like 5 boring ass minutes of watching that and playing on your phone, you're ready to take a sip of your freshly diluted absinthe. And it's still gonna taste like anise and black licorice, so have fun with that. Now, there are some bars and bartenders, for whatever purpose, they'll light the sugar cube on fire. However, that's really just for theater. It's really gonna affect the flavor in a negative way and make it taste even worse. Now, while there are a lot of fire-based cocktails out there, this isn't one I would recommend. But if you ever want a cool fire effect when you're preparing a cocktail or a tiki drink, and it actually calls for it in the recipe, throw cinnamon over the flame over the top of the glass. It'll create this really awesome fire effect, and it'll make you look like a bartender who knows what you're doing. But if you really want that From Hell, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Trent Reznor from 9 Inch Nails experience, go to your local goth club, pay $50 a glass, and get that experience. But for the rest of us out there in the world, I'm content with sticking with drinks drinks that don't taste like black licorice. And finally, no, despite what you have always heard, you are not going to hallucinate a green fairy while you are drinking absinthe. If that were true, you would also hallucinate anytime you drink vermouth, which also contains wormwood. And vermouth is in so many cocktails that I can't even begin to list them all. The only way you're ever going to really hallucinate if you drink absinthe is if some unscrupulous dickbag slips some LSD into it, or if you somehow manage to time travel back to like the 1870s and meet some unscrupulous counterfeiter of the stuff who's like mixing it up in his bathtub and decides, oh, I can get that green hue by adding copper sulfates. Which I couldn't find any real documented cases of that, but that was a concern when people were making like bootleg absinthe back in the unregulated Wild West days of food and drink production. Kind of like those moonshiners back during Prohibition who used to run their stuff through a radiator. Of course, I think if you accidentally ingest something containing copper sulfates, hallucination is the least of your worries. But let's try to end this on a positive note. So absinthe, the green fairy, that infamous bohemian drink that conjures up ideas of the Belle Epique, the Moulin Rouge and Impressionist art, the influence of artists and the bane of the fledgling wine industry. It is a fascinating drink with a fascinating history, and I'm glad I finally did a real deep dive into it. So on that note, I do believe I will end it here. Once again, this is Mike. This is Urban Legends and Mythology. As always, go check it out on the social medias, Instagram, Facebook, Threads. Surprisingly, I've come to like that one for some reason. Go follow it on Spotify. That's the host I primarily use for everything. You can check out the YouTube channel if you want. I don't really do anything with it. It's kind of just a re-upload of this same show. But if you'd rather listen to it through like your television as opposed to your phone, go for it. This is in stereo. I don't record in mono. And if you want to be a real awesome person and promote the show monetarily, you can do so through the support this podcast link in the description of every episode. You can also reach out to me personally if you don't want to do that, if you don't want your credit card information online, and we'll work out the details through that. Maybe I'll just give you my Cash App or something. But once again, I do thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.